Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I would like to talk a little bit about The Testaments by Margaret Atwood. So The Testaments is a 2019 novel that won the Booker Prize. It actually co-won the Booker Prize alongside Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, an event that was somewhat controversial at the time. But The Testaments is actually a sequel to Margaret Atwood's earlier dystopian science fiction novel, The Handmaid's Tale, which was published all the way back in 1985. So she wrote this sequel more than 30 years after the first book had been written. And if you're here, then I'm guessing you've probably read The Handmaid's Tale, or at least familiar with it. But just to give an overview for anyone who might be new or who wants a refresher, in the novel The Handmaid's Tale, we see a near-future America in which the United States has been overthrown and replaced with what's called the Republic of Gilead. And the Republic of Gilead is basically this authoritarian theocracy that brands itself as, the kingdom of God on earth, and it's based on a literalist interpretation of the Bible. Women are not allowed to read or work. Women have strict roles prescribed to them. They can be either wives, who are basically wives of rich men, and then there are econo-wives, who are women who are married to men who aren't rich. There are Marthas, who are basically household servants. There are aunts, who are kind of like female enforcers. They oversee handmaids, who I'll talk about in a second, and they also oversee executions, among other things. And then, of course, there are handmaids. And handmaids are women whom this regime, which again is based on a literalist interpretation of the Bible, women whom the regime deems immoral. So that can be anything from women who got a divorce and got remarried to women who are gay, and so on and so forth. And what the handmaids do is they're basically forced into sexual slavery. They're serially raped by commanders, who are basically the head honchos in this world, are the men who run this world. They are forced. The idea behind a handmaid is that they're supposed to bear children for commanders. And part of the motivation for that is the fact that in this near future, birth rates across the world have dropped precipitously. So people are having a very difficult time having children. And so that's part of the background for The Handmaid's Tale. And it's not explained why that happened. It's suggested that maybe it's environmental poisoning, but it's never explicitly stated. So The Handmaid's Tale is a story from the perspective of a handmaid named Offred. And The Handmaid's Tale is just a really unsettling but beautifully written and mesmerizing just exploration of this really horrific world that has been created in the Republic of Gilead. And The Handmaid's Tale is a masterwork, in my opinion. I made a video about it, and I think that it is great. And The Testaments picks up 15 years after the events of The Handmaid's Tale. And Gilead is still in power, although as we see throughout this particular novel, it has definitely started to rot, is the word that's used. It started to rot from the inside. But you also kind of see that it was never really... It was always kind of rotting, in a way, is what you kind of get the sense of in this novel. But to start with kind of how this novel is told, The Testaments is told from three different perspectives. So the first of those is a person who you will know very well if you've read The Handmaid's Tale, or if you've seen the Hulu adaptation. That is Aunt Lydia. And I will talk a little bit more about her and each of these narrators in their turn in a second. But so the first narrator is Aunt Lydia, and the way that her sections are written is basically that she is sort of hiding away in a place called Ardua Hall, which is kind of this place where aunts are trained and where they live. And she's sort of secretly writing this document for, she doesn't really say what reason particularly, but she's writing this document that you're reading. And she's doing it surreptitiously because, of course, women are not really supposed to read in Gilead. Ants are allowed to read, but they're not necessarily supposed to write that much. So if she were discovered writing this long document, she would get in trouble for it. And the other two perspectives are both young women, women who are roughly around the middle of their teenage years. One of them is named Daisy, and she is a girl who, at least at the beginning of the novel, she thought that she was born and raised in Canada. And her parents own, I believe, a clothing store, a used clothing store, and she lives what seems to be a relatively normal life until it's not normal, which I'll get to. And then the third woman is a girl named Agnes, who was, again, as she thought, born and raised in Gilead. So she's a woman of Gilead, basically. And a supporting character who appears as well is Becca, who's one of Agnes's close friends. And so those are the major characters. I will say that the perspective that I found the most interesting, but also kind of the most frustrating, was that of Aunt Lydia, because she comes out of this novel as so much more of a complicated person. You learn a lot about how she became an aunt and her motivations for basically joining the project of Gilead, doing things that, were horrible. You kind of learn why she did that. And you learn other things about her, which I can't go into without spoiling everything. But she comes out of this novel as a much more nuanced character, but still quite a fascinating character. But what's cool about her perspective as well is in her chapters, we get the closest look at what I said before about how Gilead is rotting. And sort of probably has always been rotting, has never really been functional, I guess. Basically, she knows the hypocrisy of a lot of the men in Gilead. There's this one high-ranking man who she works with very closely who is basically a pedophile. He keeps marrying young women, and, you can guess where that's going. And those young women have a tendency to keep dying, and he keeps wanting to get remarried. And you learn things like that about the inner workings of Gilead all throughout this book. But I feel like that's just a huge theme of Aunt Lydia's chapters, is there's this outward veneer of morality and righteousness and uprightness, but within there's all this sleaziness and hypocrisy and violence. And I feel like the perfect kind of metaphor for that, and for just the project of Gilead, is this thing called the Bloodlines Genealogical Archives. So the Bloodlines Genealogical Archives is kind of a big compendious book that's meant to keep track of who's related to whom in Gilead, essentially. Because like I said, you have these handmaids who are passed around from commander to commander. So a handmaid will stay with one commander for 2 years, hopefully produce a child, and then be sent off to another commander. And when you have that happening, you need to do stuff to prevent incest, right? You don't want a handmaid accidentally getting into a house where the commander is somehow related to her through some convoluted line. And another wrinkle in all this is that a lot of the children that handmaids produce are not actually sired by the commanders they're assigned to. They're fathered by drivers who are men who drive commanders around, or guardians who are basically soldiers, because sometimes the commanders themselves are sterile and can't produce children. So the handmaids, out of desperation to produce a child, because if they don't produce a child, they will get sent off to the colonies, which is where basically they go to shovel up toxic waste for the rest of their lives. They're desperate to produce children, so they'll, try to get a child by a different man. And so when you have all that going on, you need to keep careful track of who's related to whom so that you can prevent incest. But of course, those bloodlines need to be who the real father is. Obviously, outwardly, it's always the commander who's the father of the child, but often that's not the case. But in the Bloodlines archive, you have to document who was the real father. And so that's what the Bloodlines Genealogical Archive is. And I feel like it's like the perfect just metaphor for what Gilead is, right? You have this outward veneer of, yes, these commanders have these children by these handmaids, but really there's different stuff going on behind the scenes. So Aunt Lydia's chapters were fascinating in what happened in them. Now, I am very conflicted about Aunt Lydia's chapters in the book because, in my opinion, they're also the worst written sections of the book. Most of the prose throughout this novel is pretty workmanlike. One of the things that makes The Handmaid's Tale great is that the writing just soars. It's just magnificently written. But the writing in this book is much more pedestrian, much more down to earth, and workmanlike. But in Aunt Lydia's chapters, it's downright bad. Aunt Lydia just seems to always be using verbal cliches all the time, and I've marked a few. So let me just find a couple I can read to you. Hell was paved with good intentions. There's one. If life gives you lemons, make lemonade. Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. So anyway, Aunt Lydia's chapters are just chock full of those kinds of cliche sayings. And her chapters are also just really pompous. And at first, when I was reading the book, I was telling myself that that was probably a stylistic choice on Margaret Atwood's part, that maybe Aunt Lydia, as an individual, doesn't have the facility for language that Margaret Atwood does, and so she was intentionally writing with kind of this pedestrian style and with these cliches, because Aunt Lydia herself would not necessarily have been a great writer. But I feel like if an author is going to do something like that, then it needs to feel like it's really adding something to the story. And for me, at least, it didn't really add much. For me, it was just grating and annoying. So that's probably my biggest gripe with the book on the whole, is the writing, but the writing in particular in Aunt Lydia's chapters. Some of the writing in the other chapters is also a little bit clunky. The dialogue isn't always great, but the writing in Aunt Lydia's chapters in particular is just bad. So, like I said, I'm a little bit conflicted about her because she's so interesting and her chapters are so interesting. What happens in them is interesting, but they're just not well written, you know? Okay, so moving on to the other two perspectives. So Agnes, the girl raised in Gilead, she, near the beginning of this novel, is being set up to get married. So young women, high-ranking young women, basically the roles that they can enter are become a wife of a commander, or they can become an aunt. And I'm not sure how they become Marthas, but and if they do something bad, then they're made a handmaid. But Agnes, at the beginning of this novel, is the daughter of a high-ranking commander, and so she's being set up to get married. But she does not want to get married. She doesn't like the idea of it. She's been sort of soured on the idea of marriage, in particular by one instance, one really unsettling scene in the novel in which she is molested by a dentist, which I will let you experience if you read the novel. And so what she does is basically she decides to escape from getting married, and the man that she was being set to marry, because young women aren't allowed to decide who they marry in Gilead. The man who she was going to marry was that pedophile man whose wives kept dying. So that was another part of it. But basically what she does is she decides to become an aunt, because that's one of the only ways that a woman can avoid getting married. And she basically has to trick her parents into allowing her to become an aunt. But what's quite interesting about that is the fact that you actually get a little bit of a look at how aunts are made, how they're trained, and that is something that you learn nothing about in The Handmaid's Tale, which I thought was quite interesting. But I think what comes out the most in Agnes's chapters is just how dysfunctional family life in Gilead is based on this system. I mean, you can imagine that it would be, and it totally is. She has an abusive stepmother. She has a father, he's not her real father, but father who doesn't seem to care about her at all. And her best friend, Becca, attempts suicide because she doesn't want to marry either. But so Becca and Agnes end up going to become aunts. And that's sort of what her story is about. And then the third perspective is Daisy, this Canadian girl, or ostensibly Canadian girl. And again, she lives a relatively normal life until she doesn't. Basically, her life is turned upside down when she finds out two things. One, that her parents are not really her biological parents. And two, that her parents are Mayday operatives. And Mayday is this resistance group that I think is officially classified as a terrorist group but they're basically the resistance against Gilead. And so her parents turn out to be Mayday operatives who were helping handmaids to escape from Gilead and do other things. But what she also finds out is that her real mother was a handmaid who managed to get her out of Gilead. And her biological mother has been working as a Mayday operative as well. And that's sort of where her story picks up. I will say that I think Daisy is the least interesting of the three narrators. She doesn't have much of an individual personality, really, and she feels very much like a pawn in the plot. A lot of the characters feel like pawns in the plot of this novel. I feel like characterization and emotion are kind of sacrificed in service to the plot in this book. And that said, I will say that the plot of this book is at times not very well constructed. I think there are some aspects of it that are kind of lazy. I feel like a lot of the time things are just too easy for various characters. And there's even one part where I detected a straight up plot hole in it. But it's not a terribly constructed plot, but it does seem to have its creaks. I will say though that the book is very gripping. It's definitely a page turner, which is something that a lot of people have said about it. It reads sort of like a thriller. So it's gripping. It's very easy to read. I got through it very quickly. I enjoyed reading it. You know, again, as you've probably gathered from what I've said, I found the story very, very interesting. But I think ultimately at the end of it, I'm left with a feeling that The Testaments is kind of trivial. It kind of feels like a novel which Margaret Atwood wrote already knowing what she wanted to say when she started it. And so it says what it wants to say very, very well, but what it's saying, I think, is ultimately a lot more trivial than in The Handmaid's Tale, because The Handmaid's Tale is a book where you could return to it and see new things in it, and you might interpret it differently on a reread. Whereas I feel like The Testaments is pretty much a square, cut and dry, here's what you're getting, and what's on the surface is what you get. And so, while it's enjoyable, I think it's sort of a lesser work for me. But I think, as I mentioned before, I think the emotional side of the story is kind of sacrificed in the service of the plot. And what I found the most disappointing at the end was just how emotionally uninvolving the whole thing was, right? Like, these characters are in really tense and tragic situations, you know? Daisy finding out that her parents aren't who she thinks they are, Agnes being sexually assaulted and being in an abusive household, you know, like Agnes's friend Becca, her best friend Becca, who also decides to become an aunt, attempts suicide at one point in the book. And Aunt Lydia as well. Her chapters are supposed to be more emotionally affecting than I think they really are. And this could have been such a powerful story, but somehow it all just feels like it happens at a remove from you. You know, I never felt super invested in the relationships between the people or the emotional lives of the people in the story in this book. And so it could have been really powerful, but it just wasn't. It was just interesting. So anyway, that is my sort of mixed to negative review of The Testaments. I definitely did enjoy it, but it's not what I would call a great novel. And whether I'll ever reread it, I can't say. So anyway, I will leave it at that. If you have read The Testaments, let me know what you think of it. I'd love to talk about it. If you just read The Handmaid's Tale and you're here, then let me know what you think as well. But other than that, I will leave it at that. Thank you for watching once again, and I will talk to you later.